to talk about the discriminant and the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula will help find the x-intercepts. But before that, well, actually, let's talk about the formula. So again, it can solve any quadratic equation using this. X equals, all right, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. This whole thing divided by 2a. That can solve any quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. You already know part of it. Negative b over 2a, what does that help us find? Axis of symmetry. We've seen the plus minus before. So here we have the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Let's talk about that. That is the discriminant, and that will help us determine how many real roots we have, meaning how many x-intercepts. So the discriminant is just b squared minus 4ac. Not the square root. It's just this expression underneath the radical sign. If the discriminant is greater than 0, after we plug in a, b, and c now, that means that there are going to be 2 real roots, 2 x-intercepts. If the discriminant is exactly 0, that means you have 1 real root. That means your vertex is on the x-axis. If your discriminant is less than 0, negative, then there will be no real roots. It doesn't cross the x-axis. All right, so let's look at just finding the discriminant with these equations. Make sure that all of it is on one side and one side is equal to 0. So we have 2x squared plus 10x plus 1 equals 0. So to find the discriminant, we have to identify what your a, b, and c are. So now we do have to probably use c. We do use c in our formula. B squared minus 4ac. So we're going to plug in b, which is 10 squared minus 4 times a times c. Careful of your negatives. So here we have 100 minus 8. So that gives us 92. That's our discriminant. And since it's positive, that means there are 2 real roots. All right, so 2 answers to these. Number 2, sometimes they use different variables. That's okay. It's equal to 0. That's good. Identify your a, 1, b is 6, c is 9. Again, write the formula. That helps you remember it. So we got 36 minus 4 times 1 times 9. So we have 36 minus 36, which is 0, which means 1 real root. And if you notice, this is actually a perfect square trinomial, so your vertex is on the x-axis. 1 root. Okay, we discovered that. Perfect square trinomials, they have the vertex on the x-axis. And then we have number 3. Remember, make sure one side is equal to 0 when you're identifying everything, especially your c here. c is positive 7. So a is 3, b is 4, c is 7. Again, write the formula down, gives you practice memorizing it. So you have 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times 7. So that's going to give you 16 minus 84. That gives you a negative 68, which means no real roots. That one is not crossing the x-axis anywhere. Okay? That's just finding the discriminant. So make sure you know what you are looking for. All right? In this case, I wanted the discriminant. Now, on the back, now we are going to go ahead and solve using the quadratic formula. Anytime you use the quadratic formula, I want you to write the formula down. It gives you practice memorizing it. Make sure one side is equal to 0. First, identify your A, B, and C. Write the formula down. X equals negative B plus or minus the square root, B squared minus 4AC, that's your discriminant, all over 2A. All right. Again, label is important. Just kind of like when we did slope. You want to label, label, label. So we're going to plug in B. Careful here. Negative of a negative 1. B is negative 1. Plus or minus square root. Negative 1 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1, times the negative 24. All over 2 times 1. Okay? Very important to go one step at a time. Again, finding your x-intercept. So the opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. Plus or minus square root. Negative 1 squared is positive 1. Now, you have a negative 4 times 1 times a negative 24. This turns to a positive 96. All over 2. Now, look at your discriminant. Your discriminant is what? 97. 97 is positive. That means we're going to get 2 answers here. This is how I want you to show it. Do the minus first. So you have 1 minus the square root of 97 all over 2. And then the other one is 1 plus square root of 97 all over 2. Okay, so if you're using the graphing calculator, this is important. Let's clear this. So you have 1 minus the square root. So second radical sign, 97. It is important to hit enter, because if you don't and you hit divide by 2, that means you're only dividing the radical 97. You want to divide the whole thing by 2. So hit enter, and then hit divide by 2, and then you can round to 1 decimal, negative 4.4. And then for the positive one, 1 plus radical 97, hit enter, divide by 2, 5.4. So, what this means is, remember back a little while ago when you had to identify your x-intercepts and you couldn't factor it out? It was on, I can't remember, this lesson? When you had to identify and you had to use compound inequalities because you couldn't factor those? We use that. Well, now you can actually use the quadratic formula in order to find those exact roots. All right? So, this is your answers. Your x-intercepts would be negative 4.4, comma 0 and 5.4, comma 0. But because we're not graphing, you can just leave them like that. Another important thing is, what I'm looking for is you writing the formula down. That's going to be a point each time you have one on your test. And make sure you label. That is also important. That is showing your work and following your notes. So make sure you do that. All right, let's look at another one. All right, so here we have everything's on one side. Identify. A is 9, B is 42, and C is 49. Okay, write your formula down. Negative B plus or minus square root B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. So x equals negative 42 plus or minus square root B squared, 42 squared, minus 4 times 9 times 49. All over 2 times 9. Okay, again, one step at a time. Now, this will be negative 42 still. 42 squared is 1764. Now you have minus 4 times 9 times 49. That's going to turn to be a negative, and that adds actually also 1764, all over 18. So x equals negative 42 plus or minus the square root of 0. So your discriminant here is 0, which means you're going to get one answer because that eliminates this portion right here. So you really have negative 42 divided by 18. So x equals negative 2.3. So you have one x-intercept. Look at this. This is actually a perfect square trinomial. If you do the test, if you remember how to factor, you would get, looks like 3x plus 7, 3x plus 7 if you were to go ahead and factor that. So using the quadratic formula, we get one answer. And again, I am very strict on making sure you write the formula down each time and you label. All right, that's another scenario. Let's look at one more. Remember, you're using the quadratic formula to solve, so make sure you get one side equal to 0. All right, A is 2. What's B? 0. C is 25. Okay, write the formula down. Okay, negative 0 plus or minus square root 0 squared minus 4 times 2 times 25. All over 2 times 2. Okay, here we're going to get the negative 0 just canceled out, so you really have plus or minus the square root. Now 0 minus 4 times 2 times 25 is going to give you a negative 100. All over 4. Now notice that discriminant is negative. We're not supposed to have any roots. So remember, if you take the square root, try taking the square root of a negative 100. You can't. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So that's why you can't go any further. That's why this is no roots. No real roots for that. So I gave you 3 different scenarios. One with 2 intercepts, one with 1, and one with no real roots.